the Mina-Odin Ranger District gave me the job on a Wednesday and told me to report the following Monday. 4 days to pack, drive from Little Rock, and get myself up to a tower I'd never seen on a ridge I couldn't find on a standard road map. The hiring officer, a woman named Gail Pettiford, said the position had opened suddenly. She used the word suddenly twice in the same sentence, which I noticed but didn't question. I was 26. I'd spent the previous summer on a trail crew in the Ozarks, clearing blowdowns and repainting blazes, which apparently qualified me for fire detection work in the Ouachita National Forest. The pay was modest. The posting was a GS4, seasonal mid-April through September, living on site in a cab tower on a ridge called Briar Knob. The Forest Service had reactivated the tower 2 years earlier as part of a detection gap study after a prescribed burn jumped containment lines near the Muddy Creek drainage and took out 1,400 acres of shortleaf pine nobody had intended to lose. Briar Knob sits at 2,400 feet, which doesn't sound like much until you understand the Ouachitas. These aren't the Rockies. They're long, folded ridges running east to west, covered in hardwood so thick the canopy looks solid from above. The valleys between them are narrow, humid, and full of shadows by 3 in the afternoon. From the tower, you can see maybe 30 miles on a clear day. On a hazy one, and most spring days in Arkansas are hazy, you're scanning through a white veil that makes distant smoke almost indistinguishable from weather. I arrived on a Monday afternoon in mid-April. The access road was 7 miles of Forest Service gravel that turned to rutted clay for the last 1.5 miles. Climbing the north face of the ridge through second-growth oak and hickory. My truck bottomed out twice. When I reached the small clearing at the top, maybe a 1/4 acre of mowed grass with the tower at its center, there was already a vehicle parked there. A green Forest Service pickup, newer than mine. The tower was a 60-foot steel frame with a 7x7 cab on top. The cab had glass on all 4 sides, a catwalk with a railing, and a steep metal staircase bolted to the frame in a zigzag pattern. At the base of the tower, set back about 40 feet into the tree line, was a small wooden utility cabin, sleeping quarters, a propane stove, a chemical toilet, and a storage room. This was where you actually lived. The cab was where you worked. A man was sitting on the bottom step of the tower staircase, eating an apple. He stood up when I got out of the truck. "You're the new number 2, he said. His name was Dale Whitfield. He was maybe 40, lean, with a deep tan that looked permanent rather than seasonal. He'd been on Briar Knob since the tower's reactivation. 2 full seasons already. Gail had mentioned him, only briefly, said he was experienced, said he'd show me the ropes, said he preferred to be left alone, but wasn't difficult. She hadn't mentioned that the posting was a 2-person operation. I'd assumed I was replacing someone. I wasn't. I was being added. "They didn't tell you there were 2 of us," Dale said. It wasn't a question. "No." He took another bite of the apple and looked at the tower. "Previous second quit in February. Didn't finish the season. Gail tell you that?" She said the position opened suddenly. Dale almost smiled. That's one way to put it. He showed me around that afternoon. The utility cabin had 2 cots separated by a plywood partition that didn't reach the ceiling. Dale slept on the left side. He'd been there long enough that his half looked permanent books stacked against the wall, a battery lantern, a framed topographic map of the district with hand-drawn annotations I couldn't read from a distance. My side had a bare mattress and a nail in the wall for hanging things. The cab was the real workspace. You climbed 60 feet of steel stairs, 112 steps, Dale told me, and I'd learned to count them in the dark and came up through a hatch in the floor. The Osborne firefinder sat dead center on its pedestal, a brass and glass instrument over a circular map of the surrounding terrain. Everything within visual range was marked on that map. You sighted smoke through the crosshairs, read the azimuth off the ring, estimated distance using landmarks, and called it into the Mina dispatch on the radio mounted to the wall. Dale showed me the firefinder, the radio, the lightning detector, the weather instruments on the catwalk. He showed me the binoculars, Steiner 10 by 50s, heavy and military grade, better than anything I'd ever used, and the logbook, a standard-issue green hardbound journal where you recorded weather observations, smoke sightings, visitor contacts, and anything else worth noting. The logbook was new. The first entry was dated April 7th, 11 days before my arrival. Dale's handwriting, small and precise. "Where's the old one?" I asked. "Which one?" "The logbook from before, last season." Dale was adjusting the firefinder and didn't look up. "District has it. They collect them at the end of every season." That was standard, but the way he said it flatly, without elaboration, made me feel like the conversation was being routed around something. I let it go. There was too much else to learn. The first week was education. Dale ran a tight operation. We split the day into 2 shifts. He took 0600 to 1400. I took 1400 to 2100, which covered the highest risk afternoon hours when humidity dropped and wind picked up. The person not on watch was responsible for maintenance, weather readings, and keeping the utility cabin functional. We overlapped for an hour at shift change to compare notes. Dale taught me how to scan, not just where to look, but how to look moving your eyes in a slow sweep, pausing on each sector, letting your peripheral vision do the real detection work. Smoke in the Ouachitas doesn't rise in clean columns the way it does out west. The canopy traps it. You're looking for a blue-gray haze that thickens, or a shimmer above the tree line that doesn't match the ambient temperature distortion. He taught me to distinguish smoke from fog, mist from water dogs, columns of evaporation that rise out of creek bottoms after rain and look exactly like the early stages of a surface fire. He was thorough, patient, and almost completely impersonal. In 7 days of sharing a cabin and a tower, I learned that he was from Pine Bluff, that he'd worked for the Forest Service for 12 years in various capacities, and that he didn't drink coffee. That was it. He answered questions about the job completely and questions about himself not at all. On my 8th day, I asked about the person I'd been hired alongside, the previous number 2. We were in the cab during the overlap hour. Dale was logging a weather observation temperature, relative humidity, wind speed and direction, cloud cover. The afternoon was clear, which in the Ouachitas meant you could actually see the farthest ridgelines instead of just their ghosts. "His name was Corrigan," Dale said. "Travis Corrigan. Seasonal hire, like you. Younger. Started last May." "And he quit in February?" "He quit in October. His resignation processed in February." Dale wrote a number in the logbook and set down the pen. "There's a difference. Why'd he quit?" Dale didn't answer immediately. He picked up the binoculars and scanned the southern horizon, which was a thing he did when he was thinking, or when he didn't want to be watched while he decided what to say. "He had a hard time with the nights," Dale said eventually. "The isolation?" "No, the sounds." I waited. Dale set the binoculars down. "At night, in the timber around the clearing, you'll sometimes hear things. Voices, I mean. Not words. Exactly more like someone trying to talk from too far away, or someone calling for help. But the sound is wrong. The pitch is wrong. It doesn't carry the way a human voice carries." I assumed he was hazing me. Fire lookouts have traditions, and scaring the new person is one of them. I'd heard stories from other seasonal workers about phantom knocking, strange lights, all the usual stuff that happens when you put someone alone on a mountain with too much silence and not enough sleep. Coyotes, I said. Or barred owls. Barred owls sound like people screaming. I know what barred owls sound like, Dale said, and his voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. Not anger, precision. The voice of a man making sure he's being understood exactly. I know what coyotes sound like, and what bobcats sound like, and what a fox sounds like at 2 a.m. when you're half asleep and your brain fills in the gaps. I've been in these woods for 12 years. I'm not talking about wildlife. He turned back to the firefinder and adjusted something that didn't need adjusting. Corrigan went outside one night to check on it. I told him not to. That was the beginning of the end for him up here. What happened when he went outside? Nothing happened. He walked to the tree line, stood there for 10 minutes, came back, said he didn't see anything. But after that, he heard it more often, and it sounded closer. Dale looked at me directly. You'll hear it eventually. When you do, you stay inside. That's not a suggestion. That was the most Dale Whitfield had said to me in 8 days. He didn't bring it up again, and I didn't push. I figured he was telling me his version of the standard lookout ghost story, customized for Briar Knob, and that the real lesson was simpler. Don't wander around in the woods at night because the terrain is steep, the snakes are active, and there's nothing out there that needs your attention for another 2 weeks. That's what I believed. The Ouachita Springs settled in around us. Thunderstorms rolled through every 3 or 4 days. Big anvil-headed cells that came up from the southwest and hit the ridgeline like freight trains. Lightning was constant during these storms, and our job shifted from scanning for smoke to logging strike coordinates so crews could check those spots the next day for sleeper fires, smoldering material that could flare up when conditions dried. Dale tracked lightning strikes with a focus that bordered on obsessive, marking each one on a separate overlay map he kept under the firefinder's main chart. Between storms, the days were long and slow. I learned the rhythm. Morning weather at 0600, radio check with Mina dispatch, first full scan by 0630, then scanning every 15 minutes until shift change, logging smoke reports, recording weather at prescribed intervals, watching the forest do nothing, which was actually what you wanted it to do. I spotted my first smoke on May 3rd. Southwest quadrant, azimuth 214 degrees, maybe 8 miles out. A pale smudge rising above the canopy, barely distinguishable from the afternoon haze. I plotted it on the firefinder, estimated distance using a creek junction I could identify on the map, and called it in. Mina dispatch cross-referenced with the Cedar Creek Tower 20 miles east. The triangulation put the fire at a spot near Forest Road 38, which turned out to be a campfire that had escaped its ring. Engine crew had it out within 2 hours. Dale said nothing about it, but he nodded when I logged the call. From him, that was practically a standing ovation. It was May 9th when I first heard something unusual at night. I need to be careful about how I describe this, because Dale was right. The Ouachita woods are full of sounds that can fool you. The forest here is dense, layered, and acoustically complex. Sound travels strangely through the hollows. A coyote howling in one drainage can echo off the ridge on the other side and arrive at your ears sounding like it's coming from the opposite direction. A barred owl's territorial call, the classic "who cooks for you," can degrade over distance into something that genuinely sounds like a woman yelling. This was different. It was around 1:30 in the morning. I was in my cot in the utility cabin. Dale was asleep on his side of the partition. I could hear his breathing, slow and even. The windows were open because the night was warm, mid-60s with high humidity, and the cabin didn't have air conditioning. The sound came from the south side of the clearing. It was a voice, a human voice, or something shaped exactly like one. It was saying something I couldn't make out, not because of distance, but because the cadence was off. The syllables didn't attach to each other the way syllables do in speech. It was like hearing someone read individual words from a list, each one produced separately, with a gap between them that was slightly too long. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then it stopped. I lay in my cot and listened to the silence that followed. My heart was going fast, but my mind was doing what a trained observer's mind does cataloging. Male or female? I couldn't tell. The pitch was mid-range, neither high nor low. How far? Close. Within the clearing or just at its edge? Moving? I didn't think so. The sound had come from a fixed point. I didn't get up. Dale's instruction was clear, and regardless of whether I believed his explanation, the practical advice was sound. You don't walk into dark woods alone to investigate an unidentified sound. That's not caution, that's basic wilderness sense. In the morning, I checked the south edge of the clearing. The grass was undisturbed. No tracks in the soft ground near the tree line. No sign of any animal large enough to produce what I'd heard. I walked the perimeter of the entire clearing, which took about 10 minutes. Nothing. At shift change, I told Dale. He was writing in the logbook. His pen stopped. What time? About 1:30. South side? Yes. One voice? Yes. Could you make out words? No. It sounded like words, but I couldn't understand them. Dale finished his logbook entry, closed the book, and set the pen on top of it with a deliberateness that I was beginning to recognize as his way of controlling a conversation. It'll happen again, he said, probably within the next few nights. When it does, same rule, stay inside. What is it, Dale? I don't know. You've been up here 2 years. You must have some idea. I've been up here 2 years, and I don't know. That's not the same as not having thought about it. He picked up the binoculars and started his scan. I stood there, waiting. He lowered the binoculars after a full rotation. The tower's been here since 1961. Before it was reactivated, it sat empty for over 20 years. But back when it was originally staffed 60s, 70s, into the early 80s, they went through watchers fast. Gail won't tell you this, but I pulled the old rotation records out of the district archive. Between 1961 and 1983, 14 people held this post. Average tenure, 1 season. 3 of them didn't finish their first summer. Why? The records don't say. They just show replacement dates. And Corrigan makes 15. Corrigan makes a recent example. The pattern's older than either of us. I spent the rest of that afternoon on watch, scanning the forest with the binoculars and thinking. The sky was overcast, ceiling around 4,000 feet, visibility reduced to 15 miles. No smoke, just the endless green of the canopy, the pale line of Forest Road 38 cutting through a gap to the southwest, and the occasional vulture riding a thermal above a drainage I couldn't name. I want to be clear about my state of mind at this point. I was not afraid, I was curious, and I was slightly annoyed. Dale was managing information the way some experienced field people do, releasing it in controlled doses, letting the new person's own experience fill in the gaps he left. It's an effective teaching method, but it assumes the student is willing to wait. I wasn't. I wanted to understand the operating environment I'd been placed in, and a vague warning about nighttime voices wasn't an adequate briefing. That evening, I called Gail Pettiford at the district office. She picked up on the third ring. I could hear other phones in the background, the ambient sound of a government office at the end of the day. "How's the tower?" she asked. "Tower's fine. Dale's a good trainer. Listen, Gail, can you tell me anything about why the previous number 2 quit?" Silence. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but noticeable. "Travis Corrigan submitted his resignation last fall citing personal reasons. That's what's in his file. Dale says he had trouble with the nights. Dale talks more than I'd have expected. Not much more. He said Corrigan heard things in the woods. Voices." Gail exhaled slowly. "Elliot, I hired you because you had a good season on the trail crew. You can handle remote postings, and you were available on short notice. The job is fire detection. If you're having issues with the posting, you can request reassignment. But I'll be honest, there isn't anywhere to reassign you. We're short-staffed across the district. I'm not requesting reassignment. I'm asking for information. The information is that Briar Knob is a remote posting, and some people don't adjust well to the isolation. That's the official position, and it's the only one I can offer you. Can I see the old logbooks? The ones from before the tower went dormant?" Another pause. "Those would be in the district archive. I'd have to check what's accessible. I'll see what I can do." She didn't sound hostile. She sounded tired and careful, and like she'd had this conversation before. I heard the voice again on May 11th. Same time, somewhere between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. Same location, the south edge of the clearing. This time, it was louder or closer, and I could make out more of the structure. It was definitely producing words. English words, I was almost sure, but strung together without grammar, without the rising and falling intonation that gives speech its meaning. Just words, one after another, evenly spaced, evenly stressed, like a machine reading a vocabulary list. I lay still and listened. My cot was against the south wall of the cabin, directly facing the sound. Through the open window, I could see the clearing in the moonlight, the mowed grass, the base of the tower, the dark wall of trees beyond. Nothing moved. The voice continued for maybe 45 seconds. Then it stopped mid-word, as if someone had pressed a button. The silence that replaced it was total. No insects, no frogs, no wind. The forest had gone completely quiet, which is something that happens in the presence of a large predator, but also something that happens during certain atmospheric conditions. I knew that. I held on to that knowledge. On Dale's side of the partition, the breathing was still steady. He was either asleep or pretending to be. The next morning, I found something. I was doing my perimeter check, which had become a daily habit, though Dale hadn't asked me to, when I noticed a mark on the ground about 6 feet inside the tree line, directly south of the cabin. The undergrowth there was mostly leaf litter over clay soil, and something had disturbed it. Not a track exactly, more like a compression. An area about 2 feet across where the leaves had been pressed flat and the soil beneath was visible, smooth and slightly concave, as though something heavy had stood there for a long time without shifting its weight. I knelt beside it. The impression was uniform. No toe marks, no heel strike, no claw indentations. Just pressure, evenly distributed, directly facing the cabin's south window. I marked the spot with a small cairn of stones so I could check it again later, and went up to the cab for my shift. That afternoon, while Dale was off duty, I did something he probably wouldn't have approved of. I went through the utility cabin methodically, not his personal belongings, but the storage room at the back, where old equipment and supplies were kept. Behind a stack of folded tarps, I found a cardboard box labeled BKMISCPRE-REACT, which I took to mean materials from before the tower's reactivation. Inside the box were three things. The first was a maintenance inspection form from 1994, documenting the tower's condition during its dormant period. Steel frame, intact. Minor surface rust. Cab, intact. Windows broken on north and east sides. Staircase, intact. 2 treads missing. Utility cabin, roof damage, interior water damage, not habitable. The inspector had signed the form and added a handwritten note at the bottom. Ground around base shows continued evidence of regular foot traffic despite area being gated and posted. Source of traffic not determined. Recommend camera installation. No record of whether a camera was ever installed. The second item was a Ziploc bag containing a cassette tape. The tape had no label, but someone had written on the bag in ballpoint pen, BK, August 14th, 79. Do not erase. The third was a folded piece of paper. I opened it and found a hand-drawn map of the clearing, viewed from above. The tower was at the center. The utility cabin was marked to the northeast. And around the perimeter of the clearing, someone had drawn a series of small circles, 9 of them, evenly spaced, each one positioned at the tree line. Next to each circle was a time, written in 24-hour format. 0115, 0130, 0142, 0155, 0203, 0218, 0227, 0241, 0300. The times were sequential. Whatever the circles represented, they had moved. Counterclockwise around the clearing, from south to west to north to east and back toward south, over the course of approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes. I put everything back in the box and returned it to its place behind the tarps. Then I sat on my cot and thought about what I'd found. The cassette tape from 1979 was the item that occupied me most. I didn't have a tape player, and I doubted Dale did either. But I wanted to hear what was on it. Someone had considered it important enough to label it with a specific date and an instruction not to erase it. And it had survived in a cardboard box through 20-plus years of the tower sitting empty. That meant someone had brought it back. Someone had returned to the dormant tower and placed that tape in storage, knowing the building was closed, knowing it might sit there for decades before anyone found it. That evening at shift change, I tried a different approach with Dale. I found a box in the storage room, I said. Maintenance records, a map of the clearing with times marked on it, and a cassette tape from 1979. Dale's expression didn't change. He was standing at the fire finder, checking the alignment, a thing he did every evening, though it never needed checking. You went through the storage room. I did. Find anything else? No, just that box. Dale, the map shows something moving around the clearing at night. 9 positions over about 2 hours. And the tape has a date and a note that says, "Don't erase." Dale stepped away from the firefinder and sat down in the metal chair by the radio. The cab was small enough that sitting down brought us almost knee to knee. The late sun was hitting the western glass and filling the space with warm amber light. The tape was made by a man named Harlan Jessup, Dale said. He was the watcher here in 79 and 80. 2 full seasons, which was long for this tower even then. He made the recording in August of his first season. I know because I tracked him down. You tracked him down? Took me most of my first winter. He's in a care facility in Fort Smith now. 81 years old. Memory's going, but not all the way. He remembered the tower. He remembered the tape. What's on it? Dale looked at me for a long time. The amber light moved slowly across his face as the sun dropped. He recorded the voice, Dale said. Set a microphone outside the cabin window and ran it for 4 hours. The recording is mostly dead air. But at the 1 hour 17-minute mark, there's about 90 seconds of what he picked up. And? It sounds like a person in distress. Someone hurt or lost, calling for help. The words are fragmented, but some of them are clear. Please, over here, help me. Things like that. But the pacing is wrong. The emotional register doesn't match the content. It sounds like someone who learned what distress is supposed to sound like, but doesn't actually feel it. Dale stood up and moved to the catwalk door. He opened it and stepped outside. The evening air came in, warm and heavy, with the smell of blooming redbud. Harlan told me something else, Dale said, speaking toward the forest rather than toward me. He said the voice wasn't always the same. At the start of his first season, it was just noise, broken sounds, nothing recognizable. By midsummer, it was words. By August, it was sentences. By the time he made that tape, it was producing coherent pleas for help. He turned back to face me. It was learning, Elliot. Whatever it is, it was learning. And Harlan said it had gotten better since then. Because when he visited the tower in the 90s, this was during the dormant period. He drove up here on his own, he heard it again. And by that point, it didn't just sound like a person. It sounded like a specific person. Someone he recognized. Who? His daughter. His daughter who was alive and well and living in Tulsa. The voice sounded exactly like her, calling his name from the woods. The sun dropped below the ridgeline, and the cab filled with shadow. I could hear the forest's evening shift starting up the first tentative calls of whippoorwills, the rustle of something moving in the canopy below us. That's why Corrigan quit, I said. Corrigan quit because he didn't listen to me, Dale said. I told him not to go outside. He went outside. After that, it didn't just call at night anymore. It called during the day. It called from inside the tree line while he was on watch. It used his mother's voice, his girlfriend's voice, the voices of people he knew. And the sounds got closer each time, because he'd answered it once, and once was enough for it to understand that he could hear it. Dale came back inside and closed the catwalk door. He lasted 3 more weeks after that. Then he packed his truck and drove down the mountain at 4 a.m. without waking me up. I found his resignation letter on the fire finder. One line, I can hear her everywhere and she's not here. We stood in the darkening cab. Below us, the clearing was a circle of gray-green in the last light. The trees around it were black. Why did you stay? I asked. Dale considered this. Because the job matters. Because without this tower, there's a 30-mile detection gap in the Southern District. And because I don't go outside at night, and I don't answer it. And as long as I do those 2 things, it stays at the tree line. Has it always stayed at the tree line? Dale didn't answer that. The question hung in the cab for the rest of that evening, unanswered. Dale went down the stairs and into the utility cabin without another word. I stayed on watch until 2100, logged my final weather observation, temperature 58, humidity rising, wind calm, sky clear, and called Mina Dispatch to report the tower out of service for the night. The dispatcher, a woman named Linda, who sounded like she'd been doing this since before I was born, confirmed receipt and wished me a quiet night. Standard sign-off. I wondered if she knew what quiet night meant on Briar Knob. I descended the stairs in the dark. 112 steps. Dale was right. You learn to count them. Your feet find the rhythm, and your hands know exactly where the railing bends at each switchback. By the time I reached the ground, I could hear Dale's breathing through the cabin's open window. Asleep already, or performing sleep. I was beginning to understand that with Dale, those two states might be functionally identical. I lay on my cot and stared at the plywood partition and thought about Harlan Jessup in his care facility in Fort Smith. 81 years old, memory dissolving, still carrying the sound of his daughter's voice, coming from a place his daughter had never been. That night, I didn't hear anything. The next 3 nights were silent too. I began to wonder whether my 2 episodes had been exactly what the rational part of my mind wanted them to be: acoustic artifacts, barred owls, distant hikers on the Ouachita Trail calling to each other across a drainage. The forest was dense enough and the topography complex enough to produce convincing auditory illusions. I knew this. I had studied this. During my trail cruise season, we'd once spent an hour trying to locate a woman we could hear crying somewhere uphill from a creek crossing, only to discover it was a bobcat in a territorial dispute about 300 yards beyond the ridge. Sound in the Ouachitas lies to you. That's not folklore, that's physics. But the compression mark at the tree line was real. I checked it every morning, and every morning it was unchanged. A smooth, concave depression in the soil, patient and deliberate, facing the cabin window like a seat in a theater. On May 16th, Gale called the tower. Dale was on watch. I was in the utility cabin doing maintenance on the propane system when the radio in the cab crackled with Gale's call sign. Dale answered, and I could hear the conversation faintly through the cabin ceiling. The cab was directly above. Gale wanted to inform us that a search was being organized. A day hiker had failed to return from a section of the Ouachita Trail, about 12 miles southeast of our position. Male, 34, experienced, had signed the register at the Buckeye Trailhead the previous morning and was due back at his car by evening. His wife reported him overdue at 10 p.m. Trail runners had checked the first 6 miles of his planned route at dawn and found no sign. Dale acknowledged and asked if we should increase our scanning frequency toward the southeast. Negative, Gale said. SAR has it. I just want you aware in case he turns up in your visible area. He's wearing a blue jacket and a gray pack. After she signed off, I climbed up to the cab. Dale was at the firefinder, binoculars beside him, scanning the southeastern quadrant. 12 miles is too far for us to see a person, I said, even with the Steiners. I know. He didn't stop scanning. Then what are you looking for? Dale lowered the binoculars. 12 miles southeast puts him near Suck Mountain drainage. That's rough country. Steep draws, thick undergrowth, lots of exposed rock. If he went off trail in there, he could be within earshot of the trail and still invisible to searchers. Okay? But Suck Mountain is also directly upwind of us right now. South-southeast wind at about 5 knots. Sound carries upwind poorly. If he's calling for help down there, we won't hear him up here. So what's the concern? Dale set the binoculars down and turned to face me. The concern is that something else might hear him first. That sentence changed the shape of everything I'd been told. Until that moment, I'd been thinking of the Briar Knob voice as a localized phenomenon, something that lived at the tree line around the clearing, something tied to this specific ridge. A haunting, if you wanted to use that word, anchored to a place the way ghost stories are always anchored to places. Dale was telling me it wasn't anchored. How far does it range? I asked. I don't know. I don't know if range is even the right word. I know that Harlan heard it here, and only here, for 2 full seasons. I know that the watchers before him, the ones I could track down, 3 out of 14 all described it as being in the clearing and nowhere else. But those were the 60s and 70s. That was 40, 50 years ago. And now? Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he reached under the firefinder's map table and pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before. It was a standard manila folder, worn soft at the edges, with nothing written on the outside. He opened it and spread its contents on the narrow counter beside the radio. Papers, maybe 30 pages. Some were photocopies of old forms, memos, handwritten notes on Forest Service letterhead. Some were printouts from more recent years. And some were Dale's own notes, written in his small, precise hand on lined paper. "This is everything I've put together since I got here," he said. "It's not official. None of this is in any file Gail would show you. Most of it I got from personal contacts, retired personnel, the district archive before they digitized it and lost half the records in the conversion." He pointed to a photocopy near the top of the stack. It was a memo dated June 1971, from the Mena District Ranger to the Forest Supervisor's office. The subject line read, "Anomalous wildlife behavior, Briar Knob vicinity." "Read the third paragraph," Dale said. I read it. The district ranger was reporting that 3 separate hunting parties during the previous fall had complained of hearing human voices in drainages south and southwest of Briar Knob. The hunters described the voices as calling for help. In each case, the hunters attempted to locate the source and found nothing. One party searched for 2 hours and reported that the voice seemed to move ahead of them, staying just beyond visual range, leading them deeper into a drainage before stopping abruptly. The hunters exited the drainage after dark and reported the incident to the ranger station the following day. The district ranger's memo characterized the reports as probable auditory misidentification of wildlife and recommended no follow-up action. "That's the earliest off-site report I've found," Dale said. 1971. The tower was staffed that year. The watcher was a man named Cecil Poole. He lasted 1 season. Dale pulled out another page. This one was a photocopy of a handwritten incident report from 1983, the last year the tower was actively staffed before it went dormant. The reporting officer was a volunteer search coordinator named R. Delaney. The report described the recovery of a lost hiker in the Muddy Creek drainage, approximately 8 miles south of Briar Knob. The hiker, a 60-year-old man from Texarkana, had been missing for 2 nights. When searchers found him, he was sitting in a creek bed, conscious but disoriented, with mild hypothermia. He told the search team that he had followed the sound of someone calling his name from the trail into the drainage, believing another hiker was injured and needed help. The report noted that the hiker were adamant that the voice was female, familiar, and used his first name repeatedly. His wife had been at their campsite the entire time, 15 miles away. No other women were in the search area. I set the report down. "He followed it off the trail," I said. "He followed it off the trail," Dale confirmed. 8 miles from this clearing, and the voice knew his name. Dale pulled out 3 more pages. Different years, 1991, 1998, 2003. All from the dormant period, when the tower sat empty and unmaintained. Each was a different kind of document, a sheriff's department call log, a Forest Service internal memo, a printout from an online hiking forum. Each described the same thing. A voice in the woods, south or southwest of Briar Knob, calling for help, calling names, drawing people off trail. The 1998 memo was the one that stayed with me. It described a pair of backpackers on the Ouachita Trail who became separated when one of them heard what she described as her hiking partner calling from a side drainage. She left the trail to find him. He had never left the trail and was ahead of her, not behind. She was found the following day, 1.5 miles into a drainage with no trail access, unable to explain how she'd navigated the terrain in the dark. She had scratches on her arms and legs consistent with moving through heavy brush at speed, but no memory of the transit. She remembered hearing the voice. She remembered leaving the trail. The next thing she remembered was daylight and a helicopter overhead. "The thing that gets me about that one," Dale said, "is the distance. 1998. The tower's been closed for 15 years. Nobody's up here, and it's still operating. 8-10 miles out from the clearing, using names, using specific voices." He gathered the papers and put them back in the folder. "Corrigan asked me the same question you did. Why did I stay? I gave him the same answer, because the job matters, because I don't go outside, because it stays at the tree line. That was true when I said it. I'm not sure it's true anymore." "What changed?" "Last September, after Corrigan left, I was up here alone, running both shifts, 16 hours a day in the cab. Fire season was winding down, the humidity was coming up. The risk was dropping. I had maybe 3 weeks left before closeout. And one night, I heard the voice, same as always, south side of the clearing, somewhere around 01:30. But this time, instead of the broken sentence thing, instead of the please, help me, over here routine, it said something specific." Dale looked at me, and for the first time since I'd arrived on Briar Knob, he looked like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had not put it down. It said, "Dale, can you come down? I can see your light." The cab was silent. The radio hissed its low static. Outside, the afternoon light was softening toward gold. "That's what you'd say," I said, "if you were standing at the base of the tower and someone was in the cab." "Yes, that's exactly what you'd say." And it was my name, in a voice I didn't recognize, but which sounded... He paused, searching for precision. It sounded correct, like the voice a reasonable person would expect to hear in that situation. A colleague, a fellow professional, someone with a legitimate reason to be there. Not distressed, not calling for help, just a normal request. "Come down, I can see your light." "Did you go down?" "No, but I turned the light off. And as soon as I did, it said, 'That's all right, I'll come up.'" My skin went cold. Not the dramatic, literary cold of a scary story, but the real physical cold that comes when your nervous system receives information your conscious mind hasn't finished processing. A flush of blood away from the skin. Hands going slightly numb. "I heard footsteps on the stairs," Dale said. "Metal stairs, steel treads, the exact sound a person's boots make on those steps. Climbing. I counted them, because that's what I do. I count steps on these stairs. Whoever or whatever it was climbed 31 steps. Then it stopped. 31 steps. That's the first landing. First switchback, about 15 feet off the ground. It stopped there. And the next thing it said was, 'Dale, which one is you?' The grammar was wrong. That was the detail that lodged in me. Not the impossibility of an invisible presence climbing a steel staircase, not the violation of Dale's one inviolable rule. The grammar. Which one is you? As if the question made sense, as if there were multiple options to choose from. After that, nothing. It went back down, I heard the steps descending, and the rest of the night was quiet. Next morning, I checked the stairs. No marks, no mud, nothing. But the step at the 31st tread, the one at the first switchback, had a handprint on the railing. Not dirt, not mud, condensation. like someone with slightly damp skin had gripped the railing and left a mark. How big? Normal size, adult. Could have been a man's hand or a large woman's hand. Was gone within an hour, evaporated. But I saw it. I'm not speculating about it. Dale put the folder back under the firefinder table. The gesture was final, a drawer being closed. I called Gail the next day and told her I needed a second person. Not for company, not because I couldn't handle the workload, because if it's adapting, if it's moved from broken sounds to words to names, to specific voices, to understanding architecture and climbing stairs, then I need a witness who isn't me. I need someone else to see it and hear it, so that when I write a report, it's not one man on a mountain with a story. You think Gail knows what's up here? I think Gail knows exactly what's up here. I think the district is known since the 60s. And I think the reason they shut this tower down for 20 years wasn't budget cuts. It was because the last watcher in 1983, Cecil Poole, the one-season man, went down the stairs one night and into the woods and wasn't found for 6 days. And when they found him in a drainage 4 miles south, he was alive, but he couldn't explain where he'd been. And he never worked for the Forest Service again. Gail told you this? No. Cecil Poole's son told me this. Cecil died in 2011. His son lives in Mina. We had coffee once. He said his father never talked about the tower, but he talked in his sleep for the rest of his life. Every night. Same words. I'm coming, I hear you. I'm coming. The missing hiker was found the next day. SAR located him in a creek bottom in the Suck Mountain drainage, about 9 miles from the trailhead and 3 miles off the trail. He was hypothermic and dehydrated but conscious. His account, relayed to us through Gail during a routine status call, was that he had heard another hiker yelling for help from below the trail and had descended into the drainage to assist. He became disoriented in the thick undergrowth, lost the trail, and spent 2 nights in the open. When the SAR team asked if he'd found the person who was calling, he said he hadn't. The voice had stayed ahead of him the entire time, always just beyond the next ridge of brush, always just around the next bend in the creek. He'd followed it for what he estimated was 2 hours before realizing he was completely lost. The SAR report, which I read 3 weeks later when Gail sent the summary to all active towers, classified the incident as hiker disorientation due to auditory misidentification of wildlife in acoustically complex terrain. I read that sentence 4 times. After the SAR incident, something shifted in the rhythm of life on Briar Knob. Not dramatically, not in any way I could have pointed to and said that's where it changed. It was more like a key change in a piece of music. Same notes, same tempo, different register. The voice came almost every night now. I don't mean it was louder or more frequent. I mean it stopped taking nights off. Through the rest of May and into June, there was not a single night when I lay in my cot and heard only normal forest sounds. Sometime between midnight and 3 a.m., the voice would begin, always from the south side of the clearing initially, always starting with a broken word list cadence, the one that sounded like language being assembled rather than spoken. But it was finishing faster now. Within minutes, it would smooth out into fluid speech. And the fluid speech was increasingly coherent. On May 22nd, it said, "Hello? Is someone there? I need help. I'm hurt. I think I'm lost." On May 28th, it said, "Please, my leg, I think it's broken. I can see the tower. Can anyone hear me?" On June 3rd, it said, "My name is Jennifer. I was hiking with my husband. Please, we got separated. He doesn't know where I am." Each time, it was a different voice. Each time, the scenario was slightly different. And each time, the performance, because that's what it was, a performance, was more polished. The emotional texture was improving. The first version I'd heard, back in early May, had been flat, effectless, a machine reading a script. By June, the voice cracked in the right places. It hitched with pain. It wavered with fear. It sounded real. Dale and I developed a routine. When the voice started, we would both lie still in our cots, awake, listening. We didn't speak. We didn't acknowledge what we were hearing. In the morning, at shift change, we'd compare notes, confirm the time, the content, the direction, any new characteristics. Dale logged everything in a separate notebook he kept in his personal kit, not the official tower log. "Does Mina Dispatch get the official logs?" I asked him once. "End of season, yes." "And your private notebook?" "Stays with me." "Why not put it all in the official record?" Dale gave me a look that was not quite pity, but adjacent to it. "Because the official record is a document that other people read. And the moment you put it, 0140, an unidentified voice outside the cabin, said it was a lost hiker named Jennifer with a broken leg. No corresponding missing persons report exists into an official Forest Service logbook. You're not a fire lookout anymore. You're a psych referral." He was right. I understood that. But the gap between what we were documenting privately and what the official record showed was beginning to feel structural. The official logbook for Briar Knob, if anyone read it, described a quiet, professionally run fire detection operation. Weather observations, smoke sightings, lightning logs, maintenance notes. The word voice did not appear in it once. On June 7th, something new happened. I was on afternoon watch. It was 1540, overcast, temperature in the low 80s, humidity pushing 70%. Thunderstorms were forecast for the evening, and I was watching a line of cumulonimbus building to the southwest. Tall white columns with dark bases that promised lightning within the hour. Standard watch it a summer weather. I was scanning the southeastern quadrant through the binoculars when I saw movement on the ground. The terrain in that direction drops off the ridge steeply and then levels into a drainage about a quarter mile from the tower. The canopy is broken there. A patch of tornado damage from 2017 had opened up a window in the trees. And through that window, if the light was right, you could see a section of the forest floor. It was maybe 50 yards of visibility, a small stage in an otherwise closed theater. Someone was standing in that opening. I adjusted the focus. The binoculars were excellent. At that distance, a quarter mile, maybe slightly more, I could resolve a human figure with reasonable detail. What I saw was a person standing in the gap between two fallen trees. They were facing the tower. They were motionless. I couldn't determine gender. The light was flat under the overcast sky, and the figure was partially obscured by a standing dead snag. But the posture was wrong. A person standing in the woods stands with some kind of purpose. They're resting, or looking at something, or orienting themselves. This figure was simply upright. No weight shift, no arm movement, no head turn. Standing the way a mannequin stands, with absolute mechanical stillness that a living body doesn't produce because a living body is always making micro-adjustments to balance. I watched for 2 minutes. The figure did not move. Not a shift of weight, not a breath expansion of the shoulders, nothing. I lowered the binoculars and keyed the radio. "Mina Dispatch, this is Briar Knob." "Go ahead, Briar Knob." "I have a visual on a possible person in the timber, southeast of the tower, approximately quarter mile. Stationary individual in the tornado gap. Can you confirm any hikers or personnel in this area today?" There was a pause while Linda checked. Negative, Briarknop. No permitted activity in your area today. No trail crew, no maintenance. Nearest registered backcountry camp is Buckeye, 12 miles southeast. Copy. I'll continue to monitor. I raised the binoculars again. The figure was gone. Not walking away gone. The gap between the fallen trees was empty. The standing dead snag still stood. The leaf litter on the ground was undisturbed, at least as far as I could tell from a quarter mile through 10 times magnification. Whoever or whatever had been standing there had either moved during the 4 seconds I'd spent on the radio, or had simply stopped being there. I scanned the surrounding tree line. Nothing. Dale came up for shift change 20 minutes later. I told him what I'd seen. He listened without interrupting, then asked a question I hadn't expected. When you keyed the radio, did you say the words, "I have a visual"? Yes. Out loud, through the cab window, which was open. I felt it land. The cab windows had been open. My voice, reporting a sighting to dispatch, had traveled out into the clearing and down the ridge toward the drainage. I had announced, aloud, that I could see it. And in the 4 seconds it took to make that announcement, it had removed itself from view. It heard me. Or it saw you raise the radio. Or it understands the routine well enough to know what comes after someone spots it. Dale picked up the binoculars and scanned the southeastern gap. Nothing there. It's been listening to this tower for 60 years, Elliot. 2 generations of watchers using radios, calling dispatch, reporting what they see. If it can learn voices and names, and how to construct a sentence about a broken leg, it can learn what a radio call means. The thunderstorm arrived at 18:30 and dominated the next 3 hours. We logged 14 lightning strikes, 6 of them within 10 miles, 2 close enough to rattle the cab. The rain came in sheets, horizontal in the wind, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes. I stayed in the cab running the lightning protocol, while Dale monitored the weather instruments on the catwalk between downpours. At 2100, the storm passed east and the sky began to clear. Stars appeared. The air smelled like ozone and wet pine. I made my final radio call, secured the cab, and descended. That night, the voice didn't come from the tree line. It came from the stairs. I was in my cot. Dale was on his side of the partition. It was 02:15, and I was half asleep, that shallow, permeable state where sounds from the real world thread directly into whatever your brain is generating. The sound entered my consciousness before I was fully awake to receive it, which meant I heard the first few seconds without the filter of expectation or fear. I heard it the way you hear anything that happens while you're drifting, as fact before interpretation. Metal, the specific, bright, slightly ringing sound of a boot sole on a steel stair tread. Then another. Then another. Climbing. I opened my eyes. The cabin was dark. Through the window, I could see the base of the tower in moonlight. The stairs began at the south side of the frame, rose to the first switchback at 15 feet, turned, rose to the second switchback at 30 feet, turned again, and continued to the cab at 60 feet. From my cot, I could see the first 3 flights. I saw nothing on the stairs, but I heard the steps continuing. They were past the first switchback now I'd been counting without deciding to, the way Dale counted, the way you count anything you've been trained to notice. 31, 32, 33. The second flight. A steady, unhurried pace. The pace of someone who had climbed these stairs before. On the other side of the partition, Dale's breathing had stopped. He was awake. I could feel his wakefulness, the way you feel another person's attention in a dark room, a change in the quality of the silence. The steps reached the second switchback. 47. They continued. I sat up in my cot. Slowly, not because I was being cautious, but because my body was operating on a kind of autonomic protocol that reduced all movement to the minimum necessary. I turned my head toward the window. The stairs were empty. Every flight I could see was unoccupied. Steel treads gleaming dull silver in the moonlight, the railing casting thin shadows, and nothing on them. Nothing at all. The steps reached the third switchback. 68. They continued upward, into the section of the staircase I couldn't see from the cabin window. Toward the cab. Then they stopped. A silence so total, I could hear my own blood in my ears. And then, from somewhere above us from the cab, from inside the glass-walled room where we spent our days watching the forest, a sound. The firefinder turning on its pedestal, the brass ring rotating against the map plate. A slow, deliberate rotation, the way you'd turn it if you were sighting on something, scanning, choosing an azimuth. Then a voice, not from outside the cabin, not from the tree line, from above, from the cab. Mina dispatch, this is Briar Knob. My voice, my exact voice. The cadence, the rhythm, the slight flattening of the vowels I'd picked up from 3 years of living in Arkansas. My voice, performing my radio call, 60 feet above me in an empty room. I have a visual. Then nothing. Dale spoke from the darkness on the other side of the partition. His voice was low and absolutely steady. Don't answer it. I wasn't going to. My throat had closed around whatever sound I might have made. I sat on my cot with my hands on my knees and listened to the silence above us and felt, for the first time since arriving on Briar Knob, the full dimensions of what Dale Whitfield had been living with. Not a sound in the woods. Not a ghost story about a ridge with a history. Something that could climb stairs, enter a locked cab, operate an instrument, and reproduce a human voice with enough fidelity to fool the person it had been copied from. Something that had been doing this for 60 years and was still getting better. And something that, as of tonight, had stopped staying at the tree line. In the morning, I climbed the stairs, all 112 of them, in daylight, with Dale behind me, and opened the cab hatch. The firefinder was turned. It had been centered on azimuth 0 when I secured the cab the night before. I always zeroed it, a habit Dale had taught me. It was now rotated to 174 degrees, almost due south. I looked through the sighting crosshairs at the bearing it had been set to. The tornado gap, the exact spot where I'd seen the figure standing the previous afternoon. Dale stood beside me and looked at the bearing. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he opened the logbook to a fresh page and wrote the date. "What do you want me to put?" he asked. "The truth. The truth goes in the notebook. The logbook gets firefinder displacement noted during overnight period. Possible wind-induced rotation. Realigned to 0 at 06:15. That's what the logbook gets." He wrote it. I watched him write it. And I understood, finally, why the gap between the official record and reality on Briar Knob had grown so wide over 60 years. Not because of conspiracy, not because of institutional cowardice, because the truth, written in official language, in an official book, would end the mission. The tower would be decommissioned again. The detection gap would reopen. And whatever was in the woods south of this ridge would continue operating, calling names, imitating voices, leading people off trails with no one watching. Dale was keeping the tower alive by keeping the record clean. His silence wasn't denial. It was triage. I stayed. I want to be clear about that. After the night of June 7th, I had every reason to pack my truck and leave, and I chose not to, partly because of what Dale had said about the detection gap, partly because I was 26 and still possessed the particular stubbornness of a person who hasn't yet learned that courage and foolishness share a border, but mostly because I'd heard my own voice played back to me from a room I'd locked. And instead of paralyzing me, it made me angry. The kind of anger that comes from being studied, from being used as source material. Whatever was out there had listened to me long enough to reproduce me, and that felt less like a haunting and more like a violation. I wanted to understand it, not in the way Dale understood it, defensively, through a framework of avoidance and containment. I wanted to understand it the way you understand a fire, by watching it closely enough to predict what it does next. That impulse is what led to everything that followed. And I need to describe what followed carefully, because it's the part where I stopped being a reliable narrator of my own decisions. June in the Ouachitas is when the forest stops being a place you work in and becomes a place that works on you. The humidity settles into everything: your clothes, your gear, the pages of the logbook, the air inside the cab. By mid-month, the temperature was hitting 92 by early afternoon, and the haze that rose from the canopy turned the visible world into a watercolor painting of itself. Distant ridges lost their edges. The sky and the tree line blurred into a single pale band. Scanning for smoke in those conditions was like trying to read a letter that someone had held over steam. I did my job. I want that on the record. Whatever else happened on Briar Knob, I was a competent fire lookout. I spotted 7 smokes that month, called in accurate azimuths and distance estimates, logged weather on schedule, maintained the equipment. On paper, my performance was clean. Off paper, I was conducting a parallel operation that Dale didn't know about. It started with a cassette tape. I'd been thinking about it since I found it in the storage room. Harlan Jessup's recording from August 1979, the one labeled "Do Not Erase." I didn't have a tape player at the tower, and I wasn't willing to drive 7 miles of bad road to Mina just to find one at a thrift store. But on my next 4-day rotation off, we alternated long weekends. Now that there were 2 of us, I drove to Fort Smith and bought a portable cassette player at a pawn shop for $11. I also did something else in Fort Smith. I visited Harlan Jessup. The care facility was called Ridgecrest. It was a single-story building on the south side of town, clean and quiet and smelling faintly of disinfectant and cooked vegetables. I told the front desk I was a friend of the family. They didn't check. Harlan was in a room at the end of the east hallway, sitting in a recliner by a window that looked out onto a parking lot. He was thinner than I'd expected. His face was sharp-boned and heavily lined, and his eyes had the particular clarity that sometimes accompanies cognitive decline, bright and present in the moment, even if the moments don't connect to each other properly. "Mr. Jessup, my name is Elliot Daines. I work at the Briar Knob Tower." He looked at me for a long time. His hands were resting on the arms of the recliner, and I watched his fingers tighten incrementally, the way a person grips something when the ground shifts underfoot. "They put someone back up there," he said. "2 of us. Me and a man named Dale Whitfield. He told me he visited you." "The careful one?" "Yes. He came twice. Asked me about the recording. Asked me about the sounds." Harlan's gaze drifted to the window. I told him what I could. My memory's not reliable anymore. Comes and goes. But some things don't go. Some things are in there. Permanent. "Can I ask you about those things?" "You can ask. Whether I should answer is a different question." He looked back at me. "You hearing it up there?" "Yes." How far along is it? The question startled me. Not the content, the framing. How far along? As if the phenomenon had a developmental trajectory. Stages. It's climbing the tower stairs, I said. It used my voice. It operated the fire finder. Harlan closed his eyes. He kept them closed for long enough that I thought he might have drifted off. Then he opened them, and they were wet. It didn't do any of that when I was there. It was just sounds. Sounds in the trees. Broken words, nothing you could really call speech. I made that recording because I wanted proof it was real, not something my mind was doing. When I played the tape back, I could hear it. That meant it was real. That meant the air was actually moving. Something was actually making a sound. Dale said you went back during the dormant period, in the 90s. 94. I drove up on a Saturday. The gate was locked, but I walked in. 2 miles on the road, then up the ridge. The tower was still there. Broken windows, rust, weeds growing through the stair frame. I sat at the base and waited. And you heard it. I heard my daughter. I heard Anna. Clear as you're hearing me now. She said, "Dad, where did you go?" I've been waiting. She was 30 years old and living in Tulsa, and she'd never set foot in the Ouachita forest in her life. Harlan's hands tightened on the recliner again. That was 16 years after I left that tower. 16 years, and it remembered me. Not just my name, my daughter's name, my daughter's voice. Things I'd said to it? No, I never spoke to it. I never said Anna's name out loud on that ridge, not once. Then how did it know? Harlan looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between pity and warning. That's the wrong question, son. The right question is, how long was it listening before I knew it was there? I heard it starting in July of my first season. But that doesn't mean July is when it started listening to me. It might have been listening from the day I arrived. Every phone call I made from that cabin, every conversation I had with the dispatcher, every time I talked to myself, which you do, up there alone, you talk to yourself, Anani, and you don't think anything of it, because who's going to hear you? He leaned forward in the recliner. I said my daughter's name 100 times that summer. On the phone, to myself, looking at her picture on the wall. I gave it everything it needed, and I didn't know I was giving it anything at all. I sat with that for a moment. The room was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a television was playing a game show, the audience applause tinny and distant. Mr. Jessup, do you know what it is? No. Dale doesn't either. Nobody seems to. I know, and I'll tell you why. Because everyone who's been up there long enough to really learn something about it eventually does the same thing. They leave. They leave, and they don't come back. They don't talk about it. I left. Cecil Poole left. Every watcher before me left. That boy, what was his name? The recent one? Travis Corrigan. Corrigan. He left too. And your man Dale, the careful one, he's still there, because he's built his whole life around not engaging with it. Not answering, not looking, not going outside. He's surviving it. But surviving something and understanding it are different projects. You think someone would have to engage with it to understand it? Harlan looked at me for a long, steady moment. I think that's what it wants. And I think that's why it keeps getting better. It's not just learning language. It's learning what makes a person move. What combination of sounds and words and voices will make a human being stand up and walk out the door. It's solving us. One watcher at a time, over 60 years. It's been solving the puzzle of how to make a person come to it. He settled back in the recliner and closed his eyes again. The question isn't what it is. The question is whether it's finished. I drove back to Briar Knob that evening with a cassette player on the passenger seat. I didn't listen to the tape yet. I was still processing what Harlan had said, and I wanted to be in the tower, in the place where the recording was made, when I heard it. I arrived after dark. Dale's truck was in the clearing, and the cab light was off, which meant he'd secured for the night. I parked, went into the utility cabin, and found him sitting on his cot, reading by lantern light. "Good trip?" he asked without looking up. "I went to Fort Smith. I talked to Harlan Jessup." Dale's eyes lifted from the book. He marked his page with a finger. "I told you I visited him. You told me he remembered the tower and the tape. You didn't tell me what else he said. I told you what was relevant. He said it's solving us. 60 years of watchers, and each one taught it something new about how to make a person walk out the door." Dale set the book down. The lantern threw his shadow large against the wall behind him. "That's Harlan's interpretation. Harlan spent 40 years thinking about that ridge. People who think about things that long develop theories that fit the size of their thinking, not necessarily the size of the thing." "Do you have a better theory?" "I have a practice. Don't go outside, don't answer, don't engage. It works. It's been working for 2 years. It climbed the stairs, Dale. It was in the cab. It used my voice and turned the firefinder. Your practice of staying at arm's length isn't. My practice is the reason we're both still here." His voice was calm but final. The voice of a man who had drawn a line in his mind and would not cross it. Corrigan engaged. Corrigan answered. Corrigan went outside. And within 3 weeks, his professional life, his psychological stability, and his ability to function on this mountain had all collapsed. I watched it happen. I'm not going to watch it happen again. What exactly did Corrigan do? Dale looked at me. The lantern flame guttered slightly in a draft from the window. Outside, the forest was already producing its nighttime chorus. Insects, frogs, the distant rhythmic pulse of a Chuck Will's widow somewhere downslope. "I told you he went outside one night. I didn't tell you what happened after." "Tell me." Dale exhaled slowly. "He went to the tree line, the south side, where the voice always starts. He stood at the edge of the trees, and he said, and I heard him say this from my cot. Through the open window, he said, 'Who are you? What do you want?'" Dale paused, and something answered him. "What did it say?" "I don't know. I couldn't hear it from inside. But Corrigan could. He stood at that tree line for over 15 minutes, and I could hear him responding, having a conversation. One-sided from my perspective, I could hear his half and nothing else. He was asking questions. Where are you? How long have you been here? Are you hurt? Can I help you? The things a decent person asks when they think someone needs help. And after that? After that, he came back inside. He wouldn't tell me what the voice had said. He was shaking, not from cold. It was August. He sat on his cot and he didn't sleep. And in the morning, he told me it had been a woman's voice. Young, frightened. She'd said she was lost in the woods and had been walking for days. She'd said she could see the tower, but couldn't find the clearing. She'd asked him to come into the trees and help her find the way out. Did he go? Not that night. He went the next night, and the night after that. Each time, he went a little further from the clearing. Each time, he came back later. And each time, the voice during the day, while he was on watch in the cab, while I was in the cabin below, started up earlier. Not 1 a.m. anymore. Not even midnight. 4 in the afternoon. 10 in the morning, calling his name from the tree line while the sun was up, calling it in a voice I could hear from inside the cabin, which meant it was close, which meant it wasn't staying in the trees anymore. And the voices it was using? His mother at first, then his girlfriend. Then, and this is the part that broke him, his own voice, calling his own name, from the woods. As if there were a second Corrigan out there who had gotten lost and needed the first one to come find him. Dale picked up his book again. He didn't open it. He held it like an object that represented normality, a thing from the world where people read by lantern light and went to sleep and woke up to a day that made sense. The last week he was here, he stopped sleeping entirely. He'd lie on his cot and stare at the ceiling and whisper answers to a voice I couldn't hear anymore, because it had gotten quiet enough that only he could hear it. It had calibrated itself to him. His specific hearing threshold, his frequency, like a radio station that narrows its broadcast until only one receiver can pick it up. And then he left. And then he left. And I was alone for 6 months. And it went quiet, mostly quiet, until it said my name in September and climbed the stairs. And then I asked Gail for a second person, and Gail sent you. He looked at me over the book. Please don't do what Corrigan did. I didn't answer him, not because I was planning to disobey, but because I was no longer certain that the distinction between engaging and not engaging was as clean as Dale believed. He hadn't spoken to it. He hadn't gone outside, and it had still climbed his stairs, said his name, entered his cab. His containment protocol hadn't failed, exactly, but it also hadn't held. The boundary he'd maintained was a line on a map, not a wall. I thought about what Harlan had said. It's solving us. 60 years of data. 14 watchers before the dormant period, each one a new experiment. Each departure a data point. This approach didn't work. Try something different with the next one. Broken sounds didn't work. Words didn't work. Names worked better. Familiar voices worked better still. Direct conversation worked best of all. But burned through the subject too quickly, Corrigan lasted 3 weeks after engaging. The variable it was optimizing for wasn't contact. It was sustained contact. A person who keeps coming back. A person who doesn't leave. Dale had given it the longest sustained contact in the tower's history. 2 years of silent, disciplined presence. 2 years of not responding. And the thing in the woods had used those 2 years to develop a new approach. One that didn't rely on distress calls or familiar voices. One that mimicked professional competence. A calm request to come down. A radio call in the right voice. An instrument rotated to a meaningful bearing. It was learning that Dale couldn't be drawn out by emotion, so it was trying something else. It was trying procedure. On June 14th, I listened to the tape. I waited until Dale was on watch in the cab, and I had the utility cabin to myself. I put the cassette in the player, inserted the earbuds I'd bought in Fort Smith, and pressed play. Static. The hiss of cheap recording tape running at low speed through a microphone that was probably clipped to the windowsill of the cabin I was sitting in. Behind the static, the faintest suggestion of nighttime forest sound insects, wind, the distant texture of a living landscape. I fast-forwarded to the 1 hour 17-minute mark, as Dale had described. Then I pressed play. For the first 10 seconds, nothing changed. The same static, the same ambient sound. Then the ambient sound dropped away, not gradually, abruptly. The insects stopped. The wind stopped. The tape hiss remained. But behind it was silence, of a quality I'd never heard on a recording before. Not the silence of a quiet room. The silence of a space that had been emptied. Then the voice began. It was worse than anything I'd been hearing from my cot at night. Not because it was louder or clearer. It was actually faint, distant, barely above the tape hiss. But it was 1979. This was the voice from 47 years ago. And it sounded like a rough draft. The words were, "There, please. Help me. Over here. Please." But they were delivered with a mechanical regularity that made them sound less like speech and more like a recording of speech being played back at the wrong speed. Each word was isolated. Each word was produced with the same volume, the same pitch, the same duration. There was no breath between them. No human respiratory rhythm linking one word to the next. And then, around the 40-second mark, something changed. The voice paused. There was a gap of maybe 3 seconds. When it resumed, the words were the same. "Please, help, over here." But the delivery was different. There was a hesitation before "please" that hadn't been there before. A slight rise in pitch on "help" that suggested urgency. A trailing quality on "over here" that mimicked the way a voice fades when the speaker turns their head away from the listener. It was adjusting. In real time, on the tape, across a span of 40 seconds, it was refining its performance, testing variations, seeing which combination of pitch and timing and emphasis produced the most convincing approximation of human distress. The recording ran for another 30 seconds. By the end, the voice was almost right, almost human, almost real. But there was a quality underneath it that I can only describe as absence. The sounds of distress were present. The distress itself was not. It was like watching someone cry who had learned crying from a manual. Every physical component was there. The thing that makes crying, the involuntary collapse of composure, the loss of control, was missing. The tape ended. Static reclaimed the channel. I pressed stop. I sat in the cabin and stared at the wall and thought about the distance between that recording and what I was hearing now, 47 years later. The broken machine voice on the tape, the voice outside the cabin last week that had cracked with pain, wavered with fear, produced a name, Jennifer, and a scenario separated from my husband with enough emotional specificity to fool anyone who didn't know better. 47 years of practice, 47 years of refinement. And I thought about the figure I'd seen in the tornado gap, standing still, facing the tower, because the voice had been the project for decades, and now it had a body, or something that approximated a body. It was adding components, expanding the toolkit. I put the cassette player away and went up to the cab for my shift. Dale was logging a weather observation. The afternoon was clear for once visibility 25 miles, the farthest ridgelines sharp-edged against a blue sky. "Anything on watch?" I asked. "Quiet day. 2 water dogs in the southwest, resolved within the hour. No smoke." He finished writing and set down the pen. "You look like you've been thinking hard about something." I listened to the tape. Dale's face went still. Not angry, still. And it's a rough draft. Compared to what it sounds like now, the 1979 recording is almost primitive. But you can hear it learning. In real time, within a single 90-second sample, you can hear it running variations. I know, I've heard it. "Dale, this thing is on a trajectory. You can draw a line from that tape to what's happening now and project forward. The voices got better. Then they got specific. Then they got names. Then they got architecture stairs, instruments, locked rooms. And now there's a body. I saw something standing in the tornado gap. Whatever it is, it's not just a sound anymore." Dale looked out the east windows. The forest stretched away in green folds, drainage after drainage, ridge after ridge, all the way to a blue horizon. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to respond. 3 days before Corrigan quit, he said. He told me something I haven't repeated to anyone. Not Harlan, not Gail, not in any notebook. He turned to face me. He said he'd gone into the trees on his last night out. Further than before. Maybe 200 yards past the tree line, downslope into the drainage on the south side. He said the voice was ahead of him, close, leading him. And he said he reached a point where the trees opened up into a small clearing, not a natural clearing, more like a space where nothing was growing. And in the center of that space, there was a depression in the ground. Like the one at the tree line. Bigger. He said it was maybe 10 feet across, roughly circular, and the soil inside was smooth and concave, like the inside of a bowl. And it was warm. The air above it was warm. He could feel the heat rising from the ground. What was in it? Nothing. It was empty. But it wasn't, he said it wasn't vacant. He said it felt like something had just stood up, like a chair that's still warm. He stood at the edge of it, and the voice stopped. Complete silence. And then he heard something from inside the depression, from below it, from underground. Not a voice, a sound. He described it as breathing. Slow, deep breathing. The way something very large breathes when it's at rest. Dale's hands were resting on the fire finder, and I noticed they were not quite steady. He ran. Back through the trees, back to the clearing, back into the cabin. He was leaving before dawn. I found his letter, and I found his truck gone, and I didn't see or hear from him again until I tracked down his phone number 3 months later. He answered once. He said one sentence. He said, "It's still breathing, Dale. I can hear it from here." Then he hung up. I called back. Number was disconnected. Where was he? I don't know. I don't know where Corrigan went. We stood in the cab, in the last full light of a clear Ouachita afternoon. And I understood something that reorganized everything I'd been told. Dale hadn't asked Gail for a second person because he needed a witness. He'd asked for a second person because he was afraid. Not of the voice, not of the stairs, not of the firefinder turning in the dark. He was afraid because Corrigan had found something physical, a location, a structure, a source, and had carried that knowledge out into the world and had not been free of it. The voice hadn't followed Corrigan because he'd spoken to it. The voice had followed Corrigan because he'd found where it lived. And Dale, who had spent 2 disciplined years not going outside, not engaging, not looking, had understood in that moment that his containment protocol was not a strategy. It was an avoidance of the one act that would make the situation permanent. Not speaking, not answering, going to the place. I should have recognized this as a warning. I should have heard the architecture of Dale's fear and understood it as a map with a clear label. Do not go here. Instead, I heard it as a bearing, an azimuth, 174 degrees south, downslope into the drainage, 200 yards past the tree line, a clearing where nothing grows. I am not proud of what I did next, but I need to tell it straight. On the night of June 21st, the solstice, the longest day of the year, though that's a coincidence I've never assigned meaning to, I waited until Dale's breathing settled into its slow, even rhythm. I waited another 30 minutes after that. Then I got up from my cot, put on my boots, took my headlamp but didn't turn it on, and walked out of the utility cabin. The clearing was bright under a 3/4 moon. The tower stood in the center like a steel skeleton, the cab dark above. The air was warm and still, mid-70s, saturated with humidity. No breeze, no insect sound. I stood at the south edge of the clearing and looked into the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing called. The forest was silent, in that total, pressurized way that I'd come to associate with its presence. The silence of a space that is occupied by something that has chosen not to make a sound. I walked into the trees. My headlamp stayed off. The moonlight filtered through the canopy in fragments, enough to navigate by if I moved slowly. The ground sloped downward immediately. The south side of Briar Knob dropped steeply for the first 100 yards before leveling into the drainage. I moved through understory, stepping over fallen limbs, ducking low branches. The leaf litter was damp and quiet under my boots. At about 100 yards, I stopped and listened. Nothing. The silence held, but the quality of the air had changed. Warmer. Noticeably warmer than the ambient temperature, and the warmth had a direction it was rising from below, from the ground, as if the soil itself was radiating heat. I continued. The slope leveled out. The canopy was thicker here, and the moonlight was reduced to small, bright fragments on the forest floor. I could see maybe 15 feet in any direction. At roughly 200 yards from the tree line, I was estimating based on pace count, which is imprecise on broken terrain in the dark. The understory thinned. Not gradually. It stopped. I took one step from dense brush into open space and felt the ground change under my boots. Smooth, level, free of leaf litter, free of debris, as if swept clean. I turned on the headlamp. The clearing was real. Maybe 12 feet across, roughly circular. The soil inside was bare clay, smooth and slightly concave, exactly as Corrigan had described it to Dale. The surface was unbroken, no tracks, no disturbance, no vegetation. Just clean, red-brown Ouachita clay, forming a shallow bowl. And it was warm. Not metaphorically warm. Physically, measurably warm. The air above the depression shimmered faintly in my headlamp beam, the way air shimmers above asphalt on a hot day. I knelt at the edge and held my hand over the surface. The heat was steady, uniform, and coming from below. Not surface warming from the sun. This was 2 a.m. And the ground should have been cooling for 6 hours. This heat was rising from depth. I don't know how long I knelt there. Minutes. Long enough for the warmth to become comfortable, then pleasant. Then something more than pleasant, an almost gravitational pull. A desire to move closer, to lower myself into the bowl, the way you lower yourself into a warm bath. The feeling was not rational. It was somatic. My body wanted to be closer to the heat source, and the wanting was so immediate and so physical that for a moment I couldn't distinguish it from my own volition. Then the breathing started. Below me, below the clay. A slow, massive exhalation that I felt rather than heard it. Some movement of air from underground that pressed against the surface of the depression and made the soil flex slightly under my hand. A breath in, a breath out. The rhythm of something sleeping, something enormous and patient, and directly beneath me. I stood up. I stepped back from the edge. My legs were shaking, and I let them shake, because the shaking meant my body was operating on its own threat assessment protocol, regardless of what my brain was doing. And I trusted my legs more than my brain at that moment. I turned around and walked back through the trees toward the clearing. I did not run. I wanted to. But some part of me understood without evidence, without logic, on pure instinct, that running was a behavior it would recognize. Running meant prey. Walking meant a person who had come, looked, and was leaving. I didn't know if the distinction mattered. I made it anyway. I emerged from the tree line into moonlight, the clearing, the tower, the cabin. I walked to the cabin door, opened it, stepped inside, and sat on my cot. Dale's breathing had not changed. He was asleep or performing sleep, and in either case, he had not witnessed my departure or return. Nothing followed me out of the trees. Nothing called my name. The forest remained silent for the rest of the night. In the morning, I didn't tell Dale what I'd done. Not out of shame, though shame was part of it, but because telling Dale would have forced a confrontation that would have ended one of us. Either he would have demanded my removal from the tower, or I would have had to justify a decision that I couldn't justify to myself. I'd gone looking for the source. I'd found it. And finding it hadn't answered the question I went in with. It had replaced it with a worse one. The thing in the depression, the thing breathing under the clay, wasn't calling for help. It wasn't lost. It wasn't imitating distress, because it was in distress. The voices, the names, the climbing of stairs, the turning of instruments, all of it was a lure, a fishing technique. 60 years of refinement in the craft of making a human being stand up and walk 200 yards into the dark. And the lure was working. Not on strangers, not on day hikers who heard a voice and wandered off trail. On us, on the watchers, the people stationed permanently within earshot, living in the clearing, sleeping within range, providing years of uninterrupted vocal data and emotional patterns, and the specific individualized information required to construct a perfect bait. The tower wasn't a detection post that happened to be near something dangerous. The tower was the feeding mechanism. Every watcher who climbed those stairs spoke into that radio, said a name out loud in the privacy of a cabin on a ridge, was providing the raw material for their own retrieval. Corrigan had figured this out, not intellectually, instinctively. He'd felt the warmth and heard the breathing and understood in his body what I now understood in mine. The invitation wasn't to be rescued. It was to lie down. That was why he quit. Not the voices, not the imitation of his mother or his girlfriend, not even his own voice calling his name from the woods. He quit because he found the place it wanted him to arrive at, and the place felt like rest. I spent 2 more weeks on Briar Knob. I performed my duties. I scanned the forest, spotted smoke, called dispatch, logged weather. Dale and I maintained our professional rhythm. At night, the voice continued, and I lay in my cot and listened to it the way you listen to a language you've begun to understand, against your will. It was different now. Since my visit to the depression, the voice had dropped the distress routine entirely. No more lost hikers, no more broken legs, no more please help me over here. Instead, it produced something much simpler. Breathing. Slow, steady, audible breathing. Coming from the south side of the clearing, coming from the tree line, coming on the last few nights. From somewhere closer, as if the depression in the woods had moved, or as if the boundary between the depression and the clearing had become negotiable. The breathing matched the rhythm I'd felt underground. In, out, the pace of something at rest. And lying in my cot, listening to it, I felt my own breathing begin to synchronize. Not voluntarily. My lungs adjusted their tempo to match the sound the way your footsteps adjust to match someone walking beside you. An autonomic alignment, a coupling. Dale heard it too. I know because on the morning of July 3rd, he said to me at shift change, without preamble, "Your breathing changed at night. You're matching it." I didn't deny it. I know. Do you know you're doing it while it happens, or only in the morning? Only in the morning. Dale set down the binoculars. He looked at me the way a medic looks at someone who has been exposed to something and doesn't yet know whether the dose was lethal. "I want you to request reassignment," he said. "No," Elliot. I said no. If I leave, you're alone up here. And if you're alone, eventually you'll hear your own breathing match. And there won't be anyone to tell you. Dale stared at me. I saw something move behind his expression, not agreement, but recognition. The recognition of a man who has been told a true thing he doesn't want to hear. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. "Something happened. You're different. Since around the solstice, you've been different." I could have told him. I could have described the depression, the warmth, the breathing, the gravitational pull of the bowl-shaped clearing in the dark. I could have confessed that I'd broken his only rule and found the thing that broke Corrigan. But telling Dale would have given him a location, a bearing. 174 degrees south, 200 yards downslope. And Dale, for all his discipline, was a man who had been listening to an unresolved mystery for 2 years from 112 steps above the ground. Knowing the source was right there, close enough to walk to, would have destroyed the equilibrium he'd built his survival on. So I lied. The only lie I told on Briar Knob. "Nothing happened. I'm just tired." Dale didn't believe me. I could see that. But he let it go, because the alternative was pressing until the truth came out. And the truth was something neither of us could afford. I left Briar Knob on July 9th. Not because I was reassigned, not because I was fired. I left because I woke up on the morning of July 8th, standing at the south edge of the clearing, barefoot in my sleeping clothes, facing the tree line. I had no memory of getting up, no memory of walking out the cabin door. The last thing I remembered was lying in my cot, listening to the breathing, feeling my lungs synchronize. I had been walking in my sleep, walking south, walking toward the depression. My feet were dirty, red-brown Ouachita clay, the kind that only occurs on bare ground. I'd gone past the tree line. How far, I don't know. Far enough to step on clean earth. Far enough that the warmth had found my skin while I was unconscious, and my body had followed it without consulting my mind. I packed my truck that afternoon. Dale stood in the clearing and watched me load my gear. "You're not coming back," he said. "No." He nodded. Not surprised, not angry. Resigned, in the way of a man who has watched this happen before. "I'll tell Gale I need another second. Dale, you should leave too." He looked at the tower. 60 feet of steel, the cab bright in the afternoon sun, the catwalk gleaming. The Osborne firefinder visible through the glass, centered on its pedestal, waiting for the next azimuth. "There's a 30-mile detection gap without this tower," he said. "Fire season runs through September. People's homes are in that gap." "I know." "Then you know why I'm staying." I drove down the mountain. 7 miles of gravel, then clay, then asphalt. The Ouachita forest closed behind me in the rearview mirror, ridge after ridge of green canopy folding shut like pages in a book. I reached Mina by evening. I checked into a motel. I lay on a bed that was too soft and too cool, and stared at a ceiling that was too white and too flat and too far from the sky. I could still hear the breathing. Not from outside, not from the woods, from beneath the motel floor. Faint, rhythmic, patient. The respiration of something that had been underground for longer than the building above it, longer than the road, longer than the town. The sound I'd felt through the clay on the night of the solstice, carried through limestone and sandstone and the folded Paleozoic bedrock of the Ouachita Mountains. Arriving beneath me in a motel room 40 miles from the ridge where I'd first heard it spoken aloud. Harlan Jessup heard his daughter's voice from a parking lot in Fort Smith, 90 miles away, 16 years after he left the tower. Travis Corrigan heard the breathing from wherever he'd gone, however far he'd run. And now I could hear it from Mina, from a motel bed, on my first night away. Not because it was following me, because it was already everywhere. Because the thing in the depression beneath Briar Knob was not a localized phenomenon anchored to a single ridge. It was the surface expression of something that filled the geology itself, something that breathed through the mountain because the mountain was not the container. The mountain was the body, and the tower, the clearing, the carefully maintained detection post with its firefinder and its radio and its clean official logbook, was a single open mouth on the back of something so large that 60 years of watchers had mistaken its breath for a voice. The voice was never learning to speak. The voice was always breath. We were the ones who heard it as language, because that's what humans do with breath that comes in patterns. We organize it. We assign it meaning. We hear please and help and come down, I can see your light, and we think something is talking to us, when what's actually happening is something much simpler and much worse. It's exhaling, and we're so close to its mouth that we feel the air move and call it our name. Dale is still on Briar Knob. I confirmed this through Gail Pettiford's office 3 weeks ago. He finished the season. He came back for another one. He's entering his 4th year. The official logbook continues to describe a quiet, professional fire detection operation. No anomalies, no incidents. Weather observations filed on time. Smoke reports accurate and prompt. I don't know if Dale found the depression. I don't know if he's hearing the breathing, the way I hear it constantly. Underneath everything, a frequency so low, it's less a sound than a pressure change. I don't know if his feet have started walking south without his permission. I know that the Mina Odin Ranger District posted a GS4 seasonal vacancy for Briar Knob last March. 2nd observer position. The listing emphasized the tower's importance to the Southern District Detection Network. It mentioned the remote setting, the shared quarters, the experienced lead observer already on site. It described the posting as an excellent opportunity for someone interested in fire management and wilderness observation. It did not mention the sounds. It did not mention the 60-year history of watchers who stayed 1 season and left. It did not mention Travis Corrigan or Harlan Jessup or Cecil Poole or any of the 14 names in the rotation records that Dale pulled from the district archive. It did not mention that the position has been filled and vacated 4 times in the last 2 years. Someone will take that job. Someone will climb those 112 steps and stand in the cab and put their eyes to the Steiners and scan the forest for smoke. Someone will sleep in the utility cabin on a cot 6 feet from the south wall and lie there in the dark and hear, for the first time, something that sounds like a voice in the trees. And Dale will tell them the rule. Don't go outside, don't answer. But the rule was never about keeping something out. The rule was about keeping you in the cabin, in the clearing, in the precise radius where you could hear it working night after night, learning your voice, your rhythms, your breathing patterns, your name. The rule kept you still long enough to be studied. The rule was the mechanism. I know this because I broke the rule and left. And leaving didn't save me from anything. It just meant I learned the shape of what I was leaving from far enough away to see its edges. And the edges are everywhere. The Ouachita Bedrock runs from eastern Oklahoma to central Arkansas, 300 miles of folded stone. And beneath all of it, if you're quiet enough, and it's late enough, and you've been close enough once to synchronize, you can feel it. Breathing in, breathing out. Patient, unhurried, not waiting for you to come back, just breathing. The way a mountain breathes when it's alive and has learned that the small, warm things on its surface will always, eventually, lie down.